Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at component parameters. So last lesson we looked at parameters in general, where we pass a string or an int or other types of normal C# code. But in this lesson, we're going to look at components as parameters. So whole chunks of HTML, CSS, C# code, the whole thing, arrays or component, being passed as a parameter to another page. All right, this is where things get really interesting and a lot of fun. Let's go to Visual Studio. Let's create a new project. Oops, double click too much. Blazor app, call it Blazor app, and the solution name is component parameters demo. And we'll make sure that everything's the same or normal. Blazor Server App.NET Core 3.1 and HTTPS. Hit create. And then once we get this set up, we can start thinking about what do we want to do here. Well, let's start with the data, because that's where really this whole thing is going to depend on, is some data. So let's add a new folder. We'll call it models. And in this models folder, let's create a class. And we're going to call this class the person model. And in here, we're going to have a first name and a last name. But probably a person lives at one or more addresses, meaning they have more than one or more places they call home. So let's do a prop and say a list of address model and call this addresses. Now we don't have this model yet, so I'm going to control dot here to generate the model in. I could do a new file, or I could do right here and then move it to a new file later. Let's do it right in a new file right away. So now it's created this address model. Now I can come over here. We can say street address, city, state, zip code. Now this is a US-based address. Your address may be slightly different, have a slightly different syntax to it, and that's fine. But this is just for demonstration purposes. Also note that the zip code is a string. And in the US, that might look a little weird because a zip code is typically thought of as 5 numbers. But there's also the +4, so it's 5 numbers, dash, and 4 more. And also there's certain zip codes that start with a 0 or even 2 leading zeros. And you can't have a leading 0 on a number. So just note that's why we're using a string there. It's not a mistake. Okay, so now we have an address model. We have a person model with a list of addresses. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create some way to display those on a page. The trick is we won't know how many users we have, and we don't know how many addresses each user will have. They'll be different. Think of this as data coming from a database. Now we don't have a database. We're just simulating for now. We'll do databases later, but it's the same principle, because really when it comes to a database, the database works behind the scenes in the class library or somewhere else and then just gives us a list of model. And that's what the user interface uses. Well, we're just starting from that list of model. So this will act the same as if it really had a database behind it. So there's a couple different ways you can go about composing or building out this page that's going to display all of our users. You can start from the top and work your way down, or you can start from the bottom and work your way up. I think we're going to do a little bit of both probably, but let's start with create a new page or a new folder in Pages, and we'll just call this folder user info, just to keep things separated so it's easier to see for the demonstration purposes. And it's not mixed in with the standard Razor components. This is not going to be on our path, it's just for visual use. So let's start at the bottom with the very bottom, which is an address component. So we want to go back up here to Razor components, and I want a address, I call it component. And the reason why is because if I just call it address, first of all, I'm not going to give us a path on the URL. You can't go directly to it. It's not a full page. But also, if I call it address component, then it doesn't get mixed up with an address model, or in person model, we call this addresses. I don't want all these to get confused. And it does add another layer of things that have a similar name. So just note, you gotta be careful how you call these different things. So no page directive. Okay, this is not going to have a page directive. Instead, what it's going to have is just a little bit of information about the address. Now, by looking at this, there's one thing I want to add to my model. And that is, I don't have a designation that identifies what type of address this is. So address type, we'll call it. And now you can say home address, work address, and so on. So now what I can do is I can assume that we have the information about an address. So I'm going to create those parameters in here. So parameter, and I'm going to say prop string address type. And I could create parameters basically that reflect what's in address model. But that seems like duplicate work. So instead, what I can do is I can say, you know what? Just give me an entire address model, which I don't have a using statement for that. Now I could add the using statement at the very top. So I could come up here and say at using, oops, not user, using, and then say this would be Blazor app dot models. All right, and that takes care of my issue here, and the red squiggles go away. But there's another way of doing this if you're going to do this on multiple pages, and that is we have this imports.razor down here, which has a bunch of using statements. Now this imports.razor applies these using statements to all of our pages, in this case at the top level and in all subfolders. You can create another underscore imports.razor file at a lower level, and it will apply at that level and the subsequent levels below it. So you can compose these if you want. But I'm going to say at using Blazor app.models. And what that'll do is it will bring in that models using, and now this red squiggly will go away. It will. There you go. Because it's in that imports.razor file. So just note that this is kind of like the overall using statements for all of our Blazor components or Blazor apps or pages. But then you can add individual ones if you have something specific for one page or another. But this is the overall for everybody. And this just makes sense to add it here. Now, make sure you don't have naming conflicts where you have person model in two different places, one under data and one under models, because then you'd have a conflict you'd have to resolve manually. But in general, it makes sense to put a using statement here if you'll use it more than once in more than one different Razor component. Okay, so we have the address model, and so now what we can do is we can create this little, let's just do this. Let's create a paragraph tag. Inside here we're going to say, let's create a small header, so H3. Let's actually do H4. And we're going to say at address type dot, and this is address type, which I call this address type. Whoops. Let's call this address. There we go. Address dot address type. There we go. And then underneath this, we can say Well, we're going to have, I don't know, a small paragraph that's just going to be address.street address. And then we'll have another one. And yes, it shouldn't be a P, it should be a div. Sorry. You shouldn't nest paragraphs. All right, so this should be another paragraph like so. And in here, it should be at address dot city. And this is trying to be tricky on me. There we go. So at city, comma, space, at address dot state, space, at address dot zip code. All right, so that's a standard address layout. So that's a component we've built that's going to show one address. That's all that component does. Now, let's create another component that shows a user or a person. So let's right-click on user info, add, new item, razor component, and we're going to call this the person component. And here we're going to do is we're going to say they're going to pass in as a parameter. Let's pass in the first name. And we're going to pass another parameter that is the last name. Now I could have passed in the entire object, the person model object, but I don't want to in this case because maybe I'm not always going to use this with that object. Maybe I'll use it with different objects. And so I've kind of separated out in this case. So it's up to you which way you go. Do you pass in the whole object, or do you pass in just the parameters that you think will be necessary because maybe different places will pass in that information differently? All right, so in this case, I'm going to pass in the first name and last name. And up here in H3, we'll say at first name space at last name. All right, pretty simple stuff so far. But now I want an address section. And I'm going to say H3 addresses. And then underneath that, I want to have some way of saying, hey, this is the addresses. And here's a list of them. Okay, and let's change this H3 and H2 up here just for a little separation. So since everyone can do this differently, and it may be, in fact, you know what? Maybe I don't always even have addresses. Let's take that off. I don't always have addresses, but I'm going to have a section here which could show something. So I'm going to say a new parameter, and this parameter is going to be of type render fragment. I'm going to call this my address fragment. Okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that right up here at address fragment, right below the first and last name. Now, that could be nothing. So if we have no addresses, then we won't even pass that in. But it might be that we have addresses, therefore we'll pass something in there. All right, so let's see how we would actually use this component. Let's create a page component. So existing, or a new item, and we're going to call it let's call it the directory. So this is a person directory, user directory, something like that. So this is the directory. I'm going to give it an H2 or an H1 tag, call it directory at the very top. Okay. Now in here, I'm going to get a whole bunch of information about people. So let's start with a property that is a list of person model. and we'll call this people. Okay, and then I'm going to simulate getting data from a database through a constructor. Now, this would be if you had data coming in from somewhere else already. If you're going to actually access data and kind of create it on the fly, then you'd want to do what fetch data does, which is call the on initialized async, that it awaits the load of the database and all the rest. We'll get into that when we get into databases, but for now, since I'm creating the database manually, or create a data manually, I'll have to do it right in the constructor. So I'm going to say people equals new list of people. And then in here with curly braces, I'm going to say new person model. Again, curly braces, first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey, and then I believe it's addresses equals new list of address model. Inside there, new address model. And then we're going to copy and paste this. So this is a lot of setup stuff. But new address model, we have the address type first. Let's call it the home address. And then we have the street address equals 123 Oak Street. That's not my address, but that's okay. The city, Scranton, state, PA, and the zip code, I believe is something like 18512, something like that. All right, so there's one address. I'm going to copy this, but I have two addresses. My second address will be my vacation home that I don't have. And we're going to say that this is 101 Beachfront Avenue. And this is in, I don't know, Miami, Florida. And no clue, so let's go with something like that. So there's a second address. Now, before going any further, I'm going to come down here and make sure I put my semicolon at the end of this declaration. Okay, so there's one person right here. And that's where these dotted lines really help. Comma, and put another person. And we're just going to change the values here. Sue, Storm, and Sue only has one address, and it is 115 Justice Way in, I don't know, LA, California, something like that. And it'll do one more person. We want to show one more type, which would be a person that has no addresses in their address model. So this would be Bob Smith. So no addresses in his address model. But now we have, and let's kind of collapse these down here. New person, new person, new person. So now we have this constructor directory that's going to initialize the people list with a new list of person model that has 3 people, Tim, Sue, and Bob. And they have 1 or 0 or more addresses. So now what we're going to do is we're going to show this in a spot up here where we kind of compose all this information. So let's build out this directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div with a class equal to row. And then in here, it actually expand this all out for me. That's awesome. This is a case where it's really a good idea to split this off into its own code behind. Kind of makes sense. So let's actually just do that. We get used to doing that. So let's go class, and I call this directory, and I'm going to make it a partial class, And now come over here. I'm going to cut all of this out. And I'm going to paste it in here. And we do need to have our using statements brought in. Real quick. We have this address fragment that's a render fragment. So we're going to say address fragment. Not quite what I was going for. Address fragment, and in here we can put anything you want. We can put HTML, we can actually put other components, or we can do a mix of that. So I'm going to say at if, and I'm going to say if p dot addresses dot count is greater than 0, then we're going to put a header here. Was it H2 we were going to do? Let's do H3. I think it's H3. And we'll just say addresses. Okay, so we're only going to put that H3 here if we have addresses. And then we'll do an at for each on, we'll say A is p dot addresses. All right, so for every address in here, we're going to say address component, and that takes in an address, which we're going to pass in as at A. Okay, so we kind of compose this a little bit. Let's see if it actually works the way we're intending it to. And by the way, I need to wrap this whole thing. Let's cut this out for a minute. I did a row, but in here I want to say div class equals, let's do call dash 4. And then paste it in. There we go. So let's try going to this, but first we need to actually give it a page reference. At page is going to be directory. And then we're going to go to navigation. Let's make sure we put some navigation in here. So we're going to say directory. And we'll call this user directory. And we'll change the icon. I believe we have no user. How about person? Yeah, we have person. That'll probably work. Let's see what this looks like and see if all of our composition has worked the way we intended it to. User directory. So now we have a directory of 3 people. So Tim Corey, Sue Storm, and Bob Smith. 2 of them have addresses. One of them has a home address and a vacation home. One has just a home address, and one has And then the address fragment says, hey, if there's addresses, say addresses. And if there is addresses, then list them using those components. So again, it's that composition where we're kind of bringing these things together in a way that really makes sense, in a way that allows us to kind of break apart or into pieces our application, then put it together like we do with methods and classes, rather than these massive pages that have everything on one page. So this is how you use a render fragment. You can pass in just a page if you want, or just a component, or you can pass in just a little HTML, or you can pass in a complex set of pieces that differ based upon the information you have. So the one thing that I might get questions on, or you might think about and wonder about, is can you have a list of render fragments? And the answer is no, you can't. You have to name them. And so you can't have a list of render fragment. But as you see, that doesn't really hinder you from doing anything. That just means you have to kind of think through how to put your pieces together a little differently. So that's it for this lesson. Time to practice what you've learned. Try out those fragments. Try out putting them together differently, putting different information into a fragment. Make sure you really understand how those fragments work and how you can best take advantage of them. Once you've done that, come on back for the next lesson.